Welcome to Module 9, the video training for creating labels using Genero Report Writer 2.21. The objectives of this module are threefold. First, we want to be able to have you create a report design document that's specifically designed for labels. We're also going to modify our report application so that we can add the function calls we need to print the labels, to print out to the report design document that you will have created. Finally, we're going to take a look at using visibility condition property to suppress blank report items. I've chosen to do this in terms of labels because often when you have labels, you may have lines like address 1, address 2, address 3, and if those lines are blank, you don't want a blank space appearing on the label. Instead, you want your report to condense it together so that it looks like one contiguous address. First thing is to talk about what is a label. And when we talk about a label, if you look at the diagram that I've created for you, it's typically a bunch of squares inside of a physical page. So when we talk about a label, we're talking about having more than one logical page where each of these squares is a logical page sitting on the physical page, the page that feeds through your printer. Now, labels are typically used for things like name and address stickers. You may use them to print out barcodes that you stick on inventory. A sheet of paper is the physical page, and it will typically have many labels on it or many logical pages. And these logical pages are arranged in rows and columns. For example, in the diagram that I've drawn for you here, this is an example of a physical page that has 10 logical pages. The logical pages are arranged in 2 columns with 5 rows. It's important to know about this concept of physical versus logical page because when we get into some of the functions talk about printing out to a logical page or printing out to a physical page. We're going to talk about those functions more when we get into modifying the report application. When you're creating a label report design. The size of the page that you define in the report designer is going to be equal to a single label. So you're going to look at your labels, you're going to identify what the length and what the width is of a single label, and then you're going to set the page size equal to the size of that actual label by going to File, Report Properties, Paper Settings. Once you've set up the page, you can then go and drag and drop your report objects onto this report page as you would for any other report. Let's take a quick look at Genero Studio. And here in Genero Studio, I have an example of creating a label. You'll notice that in my work area, the label's base or the page size is smaller than we're accustomed to seeing. And that's because if I go to File, Report Properties, I go to Paper Settings, you can see that I set it up to have a width of 4 inches and a height of 1.3 inches. You can see I also gave it some margins. I've decided to have 0.1 inch as the margin on the top, the bottom, the left, and the right. And I've decided to say that it's going to be in landscape mode. So here I've configured the paper settings. This is really setting the logical page size. I've said the logical page size is 4 inches width, 1 1/3 inches deep. And once I have that page on there, then I can go and drag and drop my fields as I normally do. And you can see as I scroll down here, if we look at my report structure, I have a page root. The page root is taking up the entire label. And I've just gone and placed my data values onto this page root. Something that may be interesting for you to see now is you'll notice when I place these data items out, let me look at data.customer.storenum. You'll see that when I go to what I've specified to be inside of it, I've added a trim function at the end. So in the reports we've been doing up till now, we've mainly dealt with either columns or we've placed them as individual fields on a form. Here I'm saying that I want to print out the store name, but I want you to trim any white spaces off of it. So I use the trim function on this label because I want my information on this label to be compact and concise. I don't have as much area to work with. You'll also see here I've gone ahead and I've defined my label first. I've figured out what my label is going to look like, and I'm able to do that because I have my report driver.rdd and I'm able to drag and drop the fields. Now that we've created this label, let me save it. If I want to preview it, of course, I can go and click my preview. But now that I've saved it, I can go back in and modify my report application so that it's sending across the information that we need to have these labels print out successfully. When I'm creating a label report application or an application that's going to print out labels, there's some extra function calls that I need to add prior to calling the FGL report commit current settings. And 3 of them we see up here. I need to do FGL report set logical page mapping equal to labels. I'm letting it know that I'm streaming across label data. I then need to do an FGL report set paper margins and explain what the paper margins are for my physical page. I'm also going to do an FGL report configure label output. And this is letting my page know information such as what is the label widths and label heights, how many labels we're going to have per row, how many labels we're going to have per column. And if you think about it, we're mapping the logical page, the label, to the physical page that's being used by the printer. So take a look at it. Imagine that our physical page was able to hold 4 labels like we have in our diagram here, where we have 2 rows and 2 columns. If I was going to set up my report application to print out these labels, what I would need to do is I need to have, here we've done it using variables, I have a cross and down to say how many columns we have, how many rows we have. I have a page width variable, a page length variable, and a margin variable. So here they're setting their page width and page length to be an A4 width and an A4 length. If you need to know what values to put into page width or page length, you'll want to look at the dimensions table inside of your documentation. I said we had 2 across and 2 down, so I'm putting in 2 and 2, and my margin is going to be 5 millimeters. So inside of my 4GL report application, I need to call the FGL report, select logical page mappings, and pass in labels. So now I know I'm going to be printing out labels. I then need to do the FGL report set paper margins and pass in what my paper margin is. It says 5 millimeter, and these are the 5 millimeter going around the physical page. I then need to do an FGL report configure label output. I'm saying passing in my page width and my page length, letting it know what the physical page is. For the label size, it says null and null, and we're allowed to do that because we've set up our logical page, we've set up our report design document to be the size of a single label. The last 2 parameters, how many columns across and how many columns down, we saw that we set it up to be 2 columns across and 2 rows down. Now that I've provided the FGL report configure label output function, I can then call the FGL report commit current settings so that I'm ensured that my report is set up to print as labels. Let me show you quickly how we can then modify a report application using those functions. So if I go into my report main, I find where I have my FGL report load current settings. I'm specifying the name of the report here, so I've already changed that to say customer labels.4rp. And then I need to add my functions before I do my commit current settings. The first function that we're going to need to add is the FGL report select logical page mapping to identify that we're producing labels. The next function I have to add is the FGL report set paper margins to identify the margins of the physical page. The top and bottom margin are going to be 0.5 inches each. The left and right margins are going to be 0.25 inches each. And the last function is going to be the FGL report configure label output, where I identify what type of page I'm using. I identify the size of each logical page or each label, and then I say how many labels we have going across and how many labels we have going down. So first, my paper width and paper height, I'm using letter. Next is the size of my labels, which in my case, the labels have already been identified in size in the report design document. So I'm going to enter null and null. And the last thing, how many labels across, and then how many labels down. Once I've entered these in, I have my three functions. I can save my changes. I can rebuild my application. And once the application is rebuilt, I can go ahead and I can execute that application. The application executes, but I'm only getting a single label per page. Now, why is that? If I go and look back into my code, I can see that I've used a capital L instead of a small l for labels. So it's an error I made, but I'm glad I made it because now you can see that error as well. Let me go ahead and save it again. Let me rebuild, and then let me execute once again. This time, having used the proper parameter of lowercase labels, you can see it prints as I've expected. I have 2 across, and I have 7 going down. A quick note about some product labels. Some product labels and some barcode printers may have custom page sizes, so the logical page may be the same size as that physical page. Custom page sizes via file, report properties, and paper settings. That makes sure that your label page is correctly set. Realize that these printers that deal with special product labels or these printers that deal with barcodes may treat every label as a page. So even though they might print in groups of 2 or 3, you might not need to do any special label code for those kinds of labels that are being printed out. The last thing we're going to look at inside of this presentation is talking about a typical address label problem. And this address label problem is characterized by the fact that your address may have up to 5 lines, however, it may not need all 5 lines. For example, you may have an address to, you may have a contact name, you may have information where you have it for some companies, but you don't have it for others. What our goal is to not print blank lines if there is no address to, if there is no contact name. So we don't want any blank lines between the lines of the address. We want one line to print after another, and if it's blank, to just skip it altogether. So the other label problem you can have, and I talked about this or I touched on this earlier, is that you don't want spaces to be between things like the city and the state and the zip code. So you want to make sure that you're printing contiguously and eliminating white space. And we're going to be doing that with the trim function. So just to give you a quick example of what you would have if you didn't do this, let me go and show you a sample report. So here's an example where I took out my trim functions and I took out some visibility conditions on my report. And what we can see here is the information for a complete address label. However, there was no address to, because I didn't tell it otherwise, it printed out the blank line. And I removed the trim function from the city. So it says Chicago, and there's this huge white space before we get to the state abbreviation code. So the two things we're going to look at now is how do I set my visibility condition so this white line is eliminated? And how do I make sure that my data is running together as I expect it to? To solve the question of dealing with a blank space, there's a few things we can do. You can group your items in vertical boxes and add all the lines of the address as children of this node. You can do this for sections of address. So if you have a city, state, and zip on one line, we show you at the end of this that you may want to go ahead and test for that all as one line, but you will probably add a vertical box to it and then add those items to the vertical box. But the main thing is I want you to learn about setting the visibility condition. So you set the visibility condition property of these address lines so that the line's not printed if the address is blank. So if the line is a single field, like the address one, I can do header.add1.trim. So I'm taking my field, I'm trimming that field, I'm getting the length of that field, and I'm checking to make sure it's greater than 0. If this is in the visibility condition property, it would evaluate to true if there's any value inside of header.add1, and that means that it would be printed out. If header.add1, when you trim it, has no characters left, the length would be 0, and in that case it would be false, and so that line would not print. The second example is showing you how you can identify where you want to print out the postcode. Let's say you either print out the postcode after line 1 or you print it out after line 2. So what they're doing here is they're saying, well, let me go ahead and take my value for my address 3 and my address 2. I'm going to trim them. I'm going to get the length of each, and I'm going to add them together. If it's equal to 0, well, then I know there is no line 2 or line 3, so I'm going to add my postcode to address 1. Otherwise, I will just print out address 1. So this is the situation where I need to print the postcode at the last line of the address. I don't know if there's 1, 2, or 3 lines in that address. So for when I print out the first line, I have to check and see if 2 and 3 have any value. And if they do have a value, I'm just going to print out address 1. If they don't have values, then I'm going to print out address 1, but I'm going to then add the postcode to it. So inside of our label report design here, one of the things I wanted to do was set the visibility condition on this address 2. And so my visibility condition, I wanted to take this value, which is data.customer.address2. Let me use code completion. Data.customer.address2. I want to trim it, and then I want to get its length. Now, if it's greater than 0, then it's going to be true. So I've put in my RTL expression to test that there's a data value for 2. The other thing I wanted to do was I wanted to make sure I trimmed my city. So here in my data.customer.city, let me go ahead and add a .trim. Now you'll notice in my example, I put in a layout node, and then I have each individual item sitting as its own. Instead of doing it this way, I could have done it to where I just had a single field here, and I could have said city plus white space plus state plus white space plus comma plus postcode. So whether you group them all together into a layout node, in this case I did it in a single layout node, or whether you put one word field and use your RTL expression to glue the field values together, that would be your option. Let me now save my changes. I can go into my application, rebuild my application, and execute my application. This time when I now go to look at my reports, it's used the visibility condition to eliminate that white line, and now my city and state only have a single space between them, for I trimmed the value of the city before printing it out. And this ends my presentation on using Genero Report Writer to create labels.